Welcome to this explainer. We are driving straight into one of the wildest, most fascinating psychological studies of the 1930s. We're talking about the ultimate test of nature versus nurture. What actually happens when you take a wild animal and integrate them so deeply into a human family that the lines between species start to blur. Let's jump right into the highly controversial experiment of psychologist Winthrop Kellogg and explore a study that challenged literally everything we thought we knew about human development.
So to really get what's going on here, we've got to ask the big question driving this entire endeavor. Are we shaped mostly by our genes or by the environment we grow up in? Back in the early 30s, Winthrop Kellogg wanted a definitive answer. And his method? Well, it was simple but deeply controversial. He and his wife actually brought a young chimpanzee named Gua into their own home to raise her right alongside their baby boy Donald.
This whole setup was explicitly designed to tackle the classic nature versus nurture debate head-on. You know the one, are our behaviors and abilities hardwired into our DNA, or are they entirely molded by the world around us? Kellogg basically wanted to push the nurture side to its absolute limit. He wanted to see just how human a chimpanzee could actually become if she was immersed in a 100% human environment.
And the way they did this was literally unprecedented. Gua was not treated like a lab animal. No way. There were no cages, no sterile testing facilities for her daily life. Instead, Kellogg completely blurred the lines between rigorous scientific observation and everyday family parenting. The family home literally became the laboratory, and the family dynamic was the experiment itself.
The level of immersion here was just incredible. Guyela was fully living a human life. She ate her meals at the family table, she wore human clothes, and she followed the exact same sleep schedules and playtimes as baby Donald. And through it all, every single meal, every outfit change, every nap, both kids were constantly being observed and tested.
So what actually happened? Well, the early results completely blew their expectations out of the water. You'd probably think a chimp would instantly struggle in a human household, right? The data says otherwise. Early on in this side-by-side upbringing, it genuinely looked like nurture was taking the lead. The environment was exerting an incredible amount of influence, and Gua was proving to be a shockingly fast learner.
Her early milestones were absolutely staggering. Guara adapted so well to her new environment. She rapidly learned to understand and follow simple verbal commands from her adoptive parents. She recognized the daily routines of the household, and she even figured out how to correctly use everyday objects around the house. She wasn't just surviving, she was actively navigating a human world with unbelievable skill.
And this created a totally fascinating developmental gap between the two subjects. While Donald, the human baby, was progressing at a normal, relatively slow physical pace, Gua was actually outperforming him in a bunch of physical tasks. She climbed way better, and her reaction times were significantly faster. For a brief moment in the 1930s, inside this house, it really seemed like the environment might be powerful enough to blur the physical line between human and ape.
But, as you often see in science, a massive breakthrough is usually followed by a massive roadblock. Moving into the next phase of the experiment, they hit an insurmountable obstacle. It didn't matter how much she was nurtured or how much human clothing she wore, Gua eventually slammed into a biological wall, and that wall was language. See, while Gua could understand certain words and sounds, she could never actually develop human speech. Chimpanzees just don't have the biological and neurological hardware required to produce and structure language like we do. And language isn't just about asking for food, it's the very foundation of culture. It's the engine for imagination, for storytelling, for complex, abstract thought. Without the biology for it, Gua's human development was basically capped.
Then, the experiment took a wild turn that absolutely nobody predicted. Remember, the whole premise of this study was to see how human the chimpanzee would become. The researchers were laser-focused on watching Gua for signs of humanization, but it turns out they were looking in the wrong direction. The real transformation was happening right next to her, in a totally unexpected reversal.
Here is the twist. Instead of the researchers watching the chimpanzee become more human, they started noticing that Donald was becoming more like Gua. Yeah, let that sink in for a second. The human infant, growing up alongside an ape, actually began copying some of Gua's distinct sounds and physical gestures. Plus, Kellogg noticed that Donald's own human language development was lagging behind where it normally should be for a kid his age. This leads to such a profound realization about child development. Rather than proving you could turn an ape into a human, the environment revealed something else entirely. It showed just how intensely and how completely young developing minds adapt to and influence each other.
Donald wasn't just a baseline for Gua, they were peers, mirroring each other in a powerful display of shared learning.
Because of these unexpected and honestly pretty concerning developments with Donald's language and behavior, the study was abruptly shut down. The experiment was just over. Gua was completely removed from the family environment and sent away. For Gua, this separation was sudden and absolute. The human family she'd grown up with, the people and the brothers she had bonded with, simply disappeared from her life forever.
Looking back at this historical event today, the experiment remains highly controversial. And the main criticism isn't necessarily about outright physical cruelty to the animal. It's really about the profound ethical boundaries it crossed. It completely blurred the lines between detached scientific inquiry, the responsibilities of parenting, and the psychological well-being of both a human child and an intelligent primate.
So what's the final verdict on Kellogg's bold attempt? Well, both Donald and Gua soaked up the exact same environment, proving beyond a doubt that environment, learning, and experience matter immensely. They are powerful forces that shape behavior, but ultimately, neither subject could escape the hard limits of their own biology. Nurture is incredibly powerful for sure, but nature absolutely sets the boundaries.
Which brings us to a vital shift in perspective, and honestly, I think this is the most important takeaway from this entire story. Greta never became human, but it is so crucial to understand that this does not mean she failed. Greta possessed her own remarkable intelligence. She had rich emotions, complex social abilities, and her own unique way of understanding the world. She didn't fail the experiment. She just succeeded brilliantly at being exactly what she was, a chimpanzee.
And this forces us to confront a pretty deep philosophical realization. Why do we automatically assume that becoming human is the ultimate goal? This whole experiment inherently assumed that human behavior was the highest standard to achieve. But Gua's journey makes us step back and really question that human-centric bias. I'm going to leave you with one final powerful thought for today's explainer. Gua's story is a fascinating piece of scientific history, but it's also a deeply poignant reminder. It shows us that intelligence comes in a huge array of forms across the animal kingdom. And most importantly, being different is certainly not the same thing as being less. Think about that the next time you consider the intelligence of the natural world around us. So what do you think? How much of who we are is really just who we're raised with? Thanks for joining me.